A policeman made a girl lick his shoes, not realizing who her father was. What he found out later changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments. Jamie adjusted the straps of her school backpack, the chill of the evening air brushing against her skin. The streets were quiet, dotted with the occasional passing car, and the faint hum of distant conversations seeped from nearby apartments. She had stayed late after her track practice, wanting to perfect her sprinting technique, a decision she now regretted as she made her way home under the dim orange glow of streetlights. Her father, Judge Darnell Howard, often reminded her of the importance of discipline. "Every great achievement comes from the little things you do every day," he'd say, his deep voice echoing with conviction. It was this philosophy that had pushed Jamie to train harder, dream bigger. Yet now, as she walked alone on this shadowed street, she wished she had just taken the bus with her teammates. Jamie's family was a pillar in their community. Her father, a towering figure both in stature and reputation, was a well-known advocate for justice. He had earned his reputation not just for his fair rulings, but for his vocal criticism of systemic inequities. Her mother, a no-nonsense middle school teacher, was equally respected for her dedication to shaping young minds. Jamie admired them deeply, even if she sometimes felt the weight of their expectations. But tonight, none of that felt real. The safety of her home, the unwavering support of her family, it all seemed like a distant memory as the quiet street pressed in around her. She quickened her pace, the rhythmic slap of her sneakers against the pavement a temporary comfort. As Jamie turned the corner, she caught sight of a parked police car. The sight wasn't unusual in their neighborhood. Officers patrolled regularly, often stopping to chat with residents. But something about this car unsettled her. The windows were tinted darker than regulation, and it was positioned awkwardly under a broken streetlight. She debated crossing the street to avoid it, but the thought felt silly. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Always be respectful, but never afraid. You have rights like anyone else." She walked past the car, trying to appear casual. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle rolled forward, stopping just ahead of her. The driver's door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his badge glinting under the streetlight. "Hey there, miss," the officer called, his voice calm but firm. "Where are you headed?" Jamie hesitated. She looked at the man's face, searching for a hint of friendliness, but his expression was unreadable. She clutched the straps of her backpack tighter. "I'm just walking home, sir." "Walking home, huh?" His eyes scanned her from head to toe. "Mind telling me where exactly that is?" Jamie's stomach tightened. "It's just a few blocks from here," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I was at practice." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Practice? At this hour?" "Yes, sir. I stayed late to—" She stopped herself. Why did she feel the need to explain? She hadn't done anything wrong. "Let me see some ID," the officer interrupted. Jamie froze. I don't have one with me," she stammered. "I'm only 14. The officer's lips curled into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. 14, huh? And you're out here alone at night? That's not very smart." "I'm just going home," Jamie repeated, her voice faltering. "Why don't you open that backpack for me?" he said, stepping closer. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Jamie's spine. "What?" she asked, blinking in confusion. "Open the bag," he said, his voice sharper now. "Let's see what you've got in there." Jamie's heart raced. "I don't understand." "Don't play games with me," he snapped, his calm demeanor evaporating. "You're acting suspicious. Now open the bag." Her hands trembled as she slid the backpack off her shoulders and unzipped it. Inside were her running shoes, a water bottle, and her practice jersey. She held it open, hoping he'd see there was nothing unusual and let her go. The officer peered into the bag, then straightened up. "What were you doing over at that corner store earlier?" he asked, pointing vaguely behind her. Jamie frowned. "What corner store? I didn't—" "Don't lie to me," he interrupted. "We've had reports of theft in the area. You match the description." Her breath caught in her throat. "But I didn't—" "Step over here," he ordered, motioning toward the side of his car. Jamie hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, but her father's words held her in place. "Never escalate. Stay calm. Cooperate." Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the car. The officer grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding, and pressed her against the hood. The cold metal seeped through her sweatshirt as he began to pat her down. "I didn't steal anything," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Quiet," he snapped. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Jamie felt her world tilting. The bright lights of her future, her dreams, her safety, her family's pride, were eclipsed by the cold, unyielding grip of fear. The air was heavy with silence as Jamie stood motionless against the police car, her cheek pressing against the cold metal. The officer's hands moved with a practiced authority as he patted her down, and every second felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She wanted to scream, to run, but her father's lessons on remaining composed in difficult situations kept her paralyzed. "I didn't do anything," she whispered again, her voice shaking. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he finished the pat-down and stepped back, his looming figure casting a shadow over her. He crossed his arms, staring at her as though she were some kind of puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You're awfully jumpy for someone who hasn't done anything," he said, his tone almost mocking. Jamie turned to face him, her back still against the car. "I was just walking home. I told you that. And I'm telling you, something doesn't add up," he replied, his voice growing sharper. "What's a 14-year-old girl doing out here alone at night? Where are your parents?" "They're at home," Jamie said, her throat dry. "Please, sir, I just want to go home." The officer's lips curled into a tight smile. "Not so fast. I've got a job to do, and you're looking pretty suspicious. You've got no ID, no witnesses to back up your story, and a whole lot of attitude. Sounds like someone with something to hide." Jamie's knees felt weak. Her mind raced, searching for a way to explain herself, but every word that came to mind felt like it would only make things worse. "Step back," the officer barked suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Hands on the car." "What? Why?" Jamie stammered. "Don't make me repeat myself," he said, his voice hard as steel. Her hands trembling, Jamie did as she was told. She felt the heat of embarrassment crawl up her neck as passing cars slowed down, their headlights illuminating her humiliation for anyone who cared to look. The officer leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just walk around like this and not raise suspicion? What are you, some kind of lookout? Maybe a runner for one of the gangs?" Jamie's head snapped up in disbelief. "I'm not in a gang. I don't even—" "Quiet," he snapped, his hand slamming against the hood of the car beside her. Jamie flinched, her heart racing. Her mind screamed for her to fight back, to run, to call out for help, but her body refused to move. She thought of her father again. his strong, confident demeanor, his unshakable belief in the system he had dedicated his life to. Would he even recognize her now, crumpled and powerless in the face of a man abusing his authority? "I don't know what you think you're proving by playing innocent," the officer continued, circling her like a predator sizing up its prey, "but I've seen enough of your kind to know when someone's hiding something." "My kind?" Jamie's voice cracked, her fear momentarily eclipsed by anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" The officer stopped, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the air between them felt electric with tension. Then he leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "It means you should learn to keep your mouth shut," he said coldly. Jamie felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying would only give him more satisfaction. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said again, her voice barely audible. The officer straightened up, tilting his head as if he hadn't heard her. "We'll see about that." Before she could process what was happening, he opened the back door of the patrol car and gestured for her to get in. "What? Why?" Jamie asked, panic rising in her chest. "I didn't do anything." "This isn't an arrest," he said, his tone almost casual. "Just a little ride so we can clear a few things up." Jamie hesitated, her legs refusing to move. The officer's patience snapped, and he grabbed her arm, forcing her toward the car. "No," she cried, struggling against his grip. "Please, I just want to go home." "Get in the car," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jamie froze, her body trembling as fear overwhelmed her. She let him push her into the back seat, her heart sinking as the door slammed shut behind her. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Jamie stared out the window, the familiar streets of her neighborhood passing by in a blur. She felt like a prisoner in her own city, her sense of safety shattered beyond repair. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of a run-down building she didn't recognize. The officer got out and opened her door, his hand firmly gripping her arm as he pulled her to her feet. "Where are we?" Jamie asked, her voice trembling. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his tone devoid of empathy. As he led her toward the darkened building, Jamie's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the desolation of the area and the steel grip on her arm told her it would be useless. Her father's words echoed in her mind once more. Never escalate, stay calm, cooperate. But as the officer pushed her through the door and into the suffocating darkness of the building, Jamie realized that calm and cooperation might not be enough to save her. The air inside the building was heavy and stale, carrying the faint scent of oil and rust. The dim overhead light flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the concrete walls. Jamie's sneakers scuffed against the floor as the officer dragged her deeper into the desolate structure. She tried to pull her arm free, but his grip was unyielding, his fingers digging into her skin with an authority that brooked no resistance. "Where are you taking me?" Jamie asked, her voice trembling. Panic clawed at her throat, making it hard to breathe. "Quiet," the officer barked, his voice echoing through the empty space. "You don't get to ask questions." They stopped in the center of the room, where an old, battered car sat beneath a dangling light fixture. A set of tools lay scattered across a nearby workbench, and the faint hum of the city outside felt miles away. Jamie's eyes darted around, searching for an exit, a window, anything that might lead her to safety. But the only way out was the door they'd entered, and the officer was standing between her and it. "Hands on your head," he ordered, his tone sharp and commanding. Jamie hesitated, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "Do it!" he roared, his voice booming in the empty garage. Tears streamed down Jamie's cheeks as she raised her hands, lacing her fingers behind her head. The position made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare, but the cold reality of the concrete beneath her feet kept her anchored in the moment. The officer circled her slowly, his boots crunching against the debris on the floor. "You think you can just walk around like you own this city?" he sneered. "Like the rules don't apply to you?" Jamie's breath hitched. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was just going home." "Going home," he repeated mockingly. "Sure you were. And I'm supposed to believe you're some innocent little girl, just out for a stroll? I swear I—" "Shut up," he snapped, cutting her off. He stopped in front of her, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "Do you know what your problem is?" Jamie shook her head, unable to speak through her sobs. "You don't know your place," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But don't worry, I'm going to teach you." The words sent a shiver down Jamie's spine, and her knees threatened to give out beneath her. The officer straightened up, pulling his baton from his belt and tapping it lightly against his palm. "Kneel," he ordered. Jamie froze. "What?" she stammered, her voice cracking. "You heard me," he said, his tone calm but menacing. "Get on your knees." "No," she said, shaking her head. "Please." The officer raised the baton, and Jamie instinctively flinched, her hands flying up to shield her face. "Kneel," he repeated, his voice like ice. Her legs buckled, and she sank to the floor, the rough concrete scraping against her knees. Her hands shook as she lowered them, resting them limply in her lap. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body refused to move. Every ounce of her strength was consumed by fear. The officer stepped closer, his boots inches from her knees. He tilted his head, studying her like she was an insect pinned under a magnifying glass. "Now, let's see if you can follow instructions," he said, a cruel smile playing at his lips. He pointed to his boots, scuffed and caked with dirt from the street. "Lick them." Jamie's stomach turned, bile rising in her throat. She stared at him wide-eyed, unable to process what he'd just said. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You heard me," he said, his smile widening. "Show me you're good for something." "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I won't." The officer's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He crouched down in front of her, bringing his face level with hers. "Do it," he said softly, his voice almost gentle, "or I'll make you wish you had." Jamie's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the filthy boots in front of her. Her mind screamed at her to get up, to run, to fight, but her body refused to obey. She leaned forward slowly, her tears dripping onto the floor as she lowered her head. "Good girl," the officer said, his voice filled with mock approval. The taste of dirt and leather filled Jamie's mouth, and she gagged, pulling back and spitting onto the floor. The officer stood abruptly, his face darkening with anger. "You think this is a game?" he growled, raising the baton. "No, please!" Jamie cried, throwing her hands up in a futile attempt to shield herself. "I'll do it! I'll do it!" She leaned forward again, her tears mixing with the dirt as she obeyed his command. Her mind felt numb, detached from her body, as though she were watching the scene unfold from somewhere far away. "See? That wasn't so hard," the officer said, stepping back and returning the baton to his belt. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before you mouth off to someone like me." Jamie collapsed onto the floor, her sobs racking her body as she curled into a ball. She felt broken, hollow, as though he had stripped away every part of her that made her human. "Get up," the officer said, his voice sharp and commanding. "We're done here." Jamie didn't move. She couldn't. "Get up," he barked, grabbing her arm and yanking her to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but she managed to stand, swaying unsteadily as he pushed her toward the door. As they stepped outside into the cold night air, Jamie's mind raced. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let him win. Somewhere, deep inside her, a flicker of defiance sparked to life, though it was buried beneath layers of fear and shame. The officer shoved her toward the street. "Go home," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "And remember, you tell anyone about this, and it'll be the last thing you ever do." Jamie stumbled forward, her vision blurred by tears, and began to run. She didn't look back. The night air hit Jamie's face like a slap, chilling the sweat and tears that streaked her skin. Her legs moved on their own, stumbling forward in a desperate bid to put as much distance as possible between herself and the officer. Her chest burned with each ragged breath, and her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out all sound except for the panicked voice in her head. "Run. Just run." Her sneakers slapped against the pavement as she darted into the nearest alleyway, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. The shadows seemed alive, pressing in on her from all sides, but she couldn't stop. The officer's threats echoed in her mind, mingling with the humiliating memory of what he had forced her to do. "You tell anyone about this, and it'll be the last thing you ever do." Her feet faltered as she glanced behind her, expecting to see him there, chasing her, his baton raised. But the alley was empty, save for overflowing trash cans and a stray cat that darted away at her approach. She leaned against the rough brick wall, gasping for air, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Her knees buckled, and she slid down to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on her like a tidal wave, and she buried her face in her arms, muffling her sobs. For a moment, she let herself feel the full depth of her fear, anger, and shame. But the world didn't stop spinning, and the night didn't grow any brighter. "I have to get home," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She wiped at her face with trembling hands and forced herself to stand, leaning heavily against the wall for support. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't let herself stop now. She had to keep moving. The streets felt unfamiliar, every sound amplified in her mind as a potential threat. She avoided main roads, taking narrow alleys and weaving through side streets to avoid being seen. Her mind played tricks on her, turning every parked car into a potential ambush, every shadow into a figure waiting to pounce. The humiliation of what she'd endured clung to her like a second skin, making her hyper-aware of every glance, every movement around her. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, fumbling to unlock it. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over her father's number. What would she say? How could she possibly explain what had happened? The thought of his face, the pride in his eyes replaced with anger or disappointment, made her chest tighten. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, unable to bring herself to make the call. By the time she reached her street, the first faint hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky. Her house stood at the end of the block, its porch light glowing warmly against the pre-dawn shadows. It looked the same as always, safe, inviting, but Jamie hesitated at the edge of the driveway. Her legs felt like lead, her body refusing to take the final steps that would bring her inside. What would her parents think if they saw her like this? Her mother's sharp eyes would notice the dirt on her knees, the tear-streaked face, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of invisible chains. Her father would ask questions she wasn't ready to answer, but she couldn't stay out here forever. With a deep breath, Jamie forced herself to walk up the driveway and push open the front door. The familiar creak of the hinges was both a comfort and a reminder of how exposed she had been all night. Inside, the house was quiet. Her parents were still asleep, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock the only sounds. Jamie crept upstairs to her room, careful not to wake anyone. She closed the door behind her, locking it before leaning against it and sliding to the floor. The silence in her room was oppressive, the four walls seeming to close in on her. She dropped her backpack and crawled onto her bed, curling up under the covers as though they could shield her from the world. But the safety of her room was a lie. The officer's voice still rang in her ears, and the taste of dirt lingered on her tongue. Over the next few days, Jamie withdrew into herself. She avoided her parents, skipping breakfast and locking herself in her room whenever they were home. At school, she couldn't focus. The hallways felt claustrophobic, the laughter and chatter of her classmates grating against her raw nerves. She avoided eye contact, flinching whenever someone brushed past her in the crowded halls. Her teachers noticed the change in her behavior, but Jamie brushed off their concern with half-hearted excuses about being tired or stressed. She couldn't tell them the truth. She couldn't tell anyone. Her nightmares became relentless. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that garage, the officer's voice taunting her, his boots in her line of vision. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her throat raw from screaming. Each morning, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for some sign of the person she used to be. But all she saw was a stranger. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the school library, Jamie felt a presence beside her. She looked up to see Maya, a classmate she barely knew, taking the seat across from her. Maya was known for her activism, always organizing protests and speaking out against injustice. Her sharp, determined gaze seemed to pierce through Jamie's defenses. "You've been quiet lately," Maya said, her tone gentle but probing. "Are you okay?" Jamie froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notebook. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Maya didn't look convinced. "You don't have to tell me what's going on," she said after a moment. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Jamie stared at her, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to brush Maya off, to retreat back into her shell. But another part, a small, desperate part, wanted to reach out, to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Maya placed a hand on Jamie's arm, her touch light but grounding. "Take your time," she said softly. "I'll be around." As Maya walked away, Jamie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there. For the first time since that night, she wondered if she might not have to face this alone. The house was quiet when Jamie finally emerged from her room late one evening. The faint murmur of the television drifted from the living room, and she hesitated at the top of the stairs, her fingers gripping the banister. She didn't know how long she had been standing there, frozen, before her father's deep voice called out. "Jamie, is that you?" Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to retreat, to climb back into the safety of her room and avoid the questions she knew were coming. But her legs betrayed her, carrying her down the stairs and into the living room, where her father sat on the couch with his reading glasses perched on his nose, a legal brief spread out on the coffee table in front of him. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, setting his glasses aside. His voice was warm, but there was a thread of concern beneath it. Jamie shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, something like that." Darnell Howard studied his daughter for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. He motioned for her to sit beside him, and she reluctantly did so, sinking into the couch and pulling her knees to her chest. "You've been different lately," he said carefully. "Is something going on?" Jamie opened her mouth, but no words came. She stared at the coffee table, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. How could she explain what had happened without falling apart? How could she tell him about the officer, the garage, the humiliation? How could she admit that she had been powerless? "Jamie," her father said, his voice softer now. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Her throat tightened and tears welled in her eyes. I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Darnell's brow furrowed. "Scared of what?" he asked gently. Jamie's hands clenched into fists. "Of what he'll do to me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her father's expression darkened. "Who? Jamie, what happened?" The floodgates opened, and Jamie poured out the story in broken, halting sentences. She told him about the officer stopping her, the accusations, the garage, and the degrading commands he had forced her to obey. She told him about the threats, the nights spent crying in her room, and the fear that had consumed her ever since. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face, and her father's hands were balled into fists on his knees. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he tried to contain his rage. "That bastard," he muttered under his breath. "That cowardly, power-hungry bastard." Jamie flinched at the venom in his voice, but Darnell quickly softened his tone. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Jamie. I'm sorry this happened to you, and I promise you, he will not get away with this." Jamie shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "No, you can't do anything. He said he'd make my life hell if I told anyone." Her father's grip on her shoulder tightened. "Jamie, listen to me. He doesn't have that kind of power. What he did to you was a crime, and I won't let him scare you into silence. You are stronger than he wants you to believe, and you have me on your side." The next morning, Darnell went to work with a determined glint in his eyes. Jamie stayed home from school, her stomach churning with anxiety. She spent the day pacing her room, replaying their conversation in her mind. Part of her was terrified that her father's involvement would only make things worse, but another part, a small, hopeful part, felt a flicker of relief. For the first time since that night, she didn't feel completely alone. By the evening, her father returned home with a stack of papers under his arm and a grim expression on his face. He set the papers down on the dining table and motioned for Jamie to join him. "I've spoken to some colleagues," he said, flipping through the documents. "We're going to build a case against this officer. But first, I need you to be absolutely sure you're ready for this. It won't be easy, Jamie. He'll try to discredit you, and it's going to hurt. But if we do nothing, he'll keep doing this to others." Jamie swallowed hard. "What do I have to do?" "For now, just tell your story again," he said. "I've already arranged for a lawyer to represent you, and I've requested the security footage from the area where he stopped you. If there are witnesses, we'll find them." The days that followed were grueling. Jamie met with lawyers, psychologists, and investigators, each conversation forcing her to relive the trauma. Her father was by her side every step of the way, his presence a steadying force in the chaos. He was tireless, reaching out to his network of colleagues and calling in favors to ensure the case wouldn't be swept under the rug. At one point, Darnell received a call from the officers' department. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, suggesting that the judge reconsider pursuing the matter. Darnell's response was icy. "You're suggesting I let this slide?" he said, his tone dangerously calm. "This man abused his position and assaulted my daughter. If you think I'm going to let him walk away from that, you clearly don't know me." The call ended abruptly, and Darnell returned to his work, his determination redoubled. One evening, weeks into the investigation, Jamie overheard her father on the phone in his study. "We've got the footage," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "It's damning. There's no way he's getting out of this." Jamie felt a surge of hope. She knocked on the door and stepped inside, her heart pounding. "What does it show?" she asked hesitantly. Darnell gestured for her to sit down. "The security cameras from the street captured everything," he said. "The stop, the way he manhandled you, everything. It's all there." Jamie's breath caught. "Does that mean—" "It means we have a real chance at justice," he said, his voice firm. "But it also means the trial will be public. Are you ready for that?" Jamie hesitated, her mind racing. The thought of facing her attacker in court, of having the world know what had happened to her, was terrifying. But then she thought of the other girls like her, who might not have someone like her father to fight for them. She thought of Maya's words, "You don't have to face this alone." "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The courtroom buzzed with tension as Jamie stepped through the double doors. The soft hum of whispered conversations halted momentarily as heads turned to look at her. Jamie felt her chest tighten, her fingers gripping her father's arm for support. Judge Darnell Howard walked beside her, his tall frame exuding calm authority. He gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before guiding her to their seats. The room was stark and imposing, with its high ceilings and rows of benches filled with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. At the front, the defendant's table stood empty, but Jamie knew he would be there soon. The officer who had turned her life upside down would have to face the truth today, in front of everyone. Jamie took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she sat down beside her lawyer. Her father leaned in close, his voice low but steady. "Remember, Jamie, you're not alone. We're here for you." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but it didn't matter. This was happening. The trial began with opening statements. Jamie's lawyer, a sharp, articulate woman named Miss Caldwell, stood and addressed the jury. Her voice was calm but forceful as she outlined the case, painting a vivid picture of the abuse of power and the trauma Jamie had endured. On the other side, the defense lawyer attempted to portray the officer as an overworked public servant who had merely made an error in judgment. Jamie clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Each word felt like an attack, but her father's steady presence beside her helped her stay grounded. Then came the evidence. Miss Caldwell presented the security footage, and the courtroom fell silent as the grainy black and white video played on the large screen. Every detail was there. The officer stopping Jamie, his aggressive gestures, the way he forced her into the car. Even without audio, the power imbalance was stark and undeniable. Jamie felt her stomach churn as the video continued. The footage from the garage wasn't available, No cameras had been inside, but the sight of her own terrified face on the screen brought back memories she had worked so hard to suppress. She fought to keep her composure, her father's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. When Jamie took the stand, the room seemed to shrink around her. The weight of so many eyes pressed down on her, but she focused on Miss Caldwell, who stood a few feet away with an encouraging smile. "Jamie," Miss Caldwell began, her voice gentle, "can you tell the court what happened that night?" Jamie hesitated, her throat dry, but then she began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she recounted the events, something inside her shifted. She was no longer just the frightened girl in the garage. She was a survivor, standing up for herself and others who might have been in her place. She described the officer stopping her, accusing her, and dragging her to the garage. She hesitated when she reached the most humiliating part, but the sight of her father's steady gaze gave her the courage to continue. She spoke about being forced to her knees, about the threats, and about the dirt on his boots. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Jamie looked at the jury, their faces reflecting a mix of outrage and sympathy. She wasn't sure what they were thinking, but she hoped they understood the weight of her words. The defense lawyer's cross-examination was sharp and invasive, but Jamie held her ground. He tried to suggest that she had misunderstood the officer's intentions, that she had overreacted, but her steady answers and the damning video evidence left little room for doubt. When Jamie stepped down from the stand, she felt a flicker of relief. The hardest part was over. The trial lasted several days, with more witnesses testifying, including Maya, who spoke about Jamie's emotional state after the incident, and a psychologist who explained the lasting impact of such trauma. The prosecution painted a clear picture of an officer abusing his authority, while the defense floundered, their arguments growing weaker with each passing day. On the final day, the officer himself took the stand. He denied everything, his tone cold and detached, but the jury's eyes, sharp and unforgiving, didn't waver as they watched him. The evidence was against him, and his lack of remorse only solidified the case. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was silent. Jamie held her breath, her hands gripping her father's tightly. The foreperson stood, her voice ringing clear and firm. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Jamie felt a weight lift from her shoulders, tears streaming down her face as her father pulled her into a tight embrace. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." In the days that followed, the officer was sentenced to prison, his career and reputation in ruins. Jamie's story spread, sparking conversations about police accountability and the abuse of power. Other victims came forward, inspired by her bravery, and her father used his influence to push for systemic changes in law enforcement policies. For Jamie, the journey wasn't over. The scars of that night would take time to heal, but she knew she wasn't alone. She began attending therapy, slowly rebuilding her confidence and sense of self. Maya remained by her side, offering support and reminding her of the strength she had shown. Months later, Jamie sat in her father's study, penning a letter she had been thinking about for weeks. She addressed it to him, thanking him for believing in her, for standing by her, and for showing her what justice truly meant. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. She was more than what had happened to her. She was her father's daughter, a fighter, a survivor. Jamie folded the letter and placed it on his desk. Then she stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The world felt different now, brighter somehow, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could run again, not to escape, but toward something better. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and leave your comments. It helps us create more stories like this. Also, check out the other videos on our channel. Every story here is worth your attention.